We are going to recapping the movie The Passion of Darkly Noon. Exhausted, and at the end of his rope, Darkly Noon stumbles and collapses onto a forest road, where Jude narrowly avoids running him over. Jude, an undertaker's assistant, brings the unconscious man to a secluded house, calling for Callie. Emerging from the trees, Callie suggests bringing Darkly inside upon seeing his condition. Before doing so, Jude asks about her partner Clay's whereabouts. As they lay Darkly on the bed, he briefly wakes up, and Callie reassures him he is safe. Jude suggests Clay may have left for good, but Callie remains calm, telling him to start loading the truck since no one will help. After Jude loads the last coffin, Callie assures him her guest will recover quickly. She asserts Clay loves her and will eventually return. Jude agrees and presents a tool Clay had ordered, which Callie instructs him to store in the barn. Jude unloads the supplies and suggests Callie fetch them herself, but she refuses to face the judgmental townspeople. Jude reminds her he won't always be there, as he plans to leave and become a writer. Soon after, Jude drives off as a storm hits. Later, Callie searches Darkly's clothes and finds a Bible with his name and a photo of a couple inside. The next day, a disoriented Darkly wakes and stumbles upon the sleeping Callie. She introduces herself while making breakfast. Callie reveals she lives with Clay, a carpenter who makes coffins but is currently walking in the woods. Whispering a prayer, Darkly asks if she found his Bible. Callie asks about the dedication, and Darkly explains he chose his name by randomly opening the Bible, as was customary in his religious community. Callie then asks if the photo is of his parents, which Darkly confirms were killed when vicious townspeople attacked his community. Empathizing as a fellow outcast, Callie offers for Darkly to stay as long as he likes, and shows him the comfortable barn loft where she once stayed. In the morning, Darkly is transfixed, watching Callie work on the house. He eventually offers to help, but she says the house will fall apart without Clay. Inside, Darkly declares the peas need salt, not sugar. Callie talks about the strictness of his upbringing, saying not everyone shares his religious fervor. Suddenly, gunshots ring out, and Callie rushes outside with a rifle, yelling at the woods to leave her in peace. She explains to the concerned Darkly that the gunshots are just a recurring looming presence. When her bullets run out, she reassures her guest and returns inside. After dinner, Darkly excuses himself, unable to stay due to his values, despite Callie's invitation. Later, he watches Callie lament Clay's absence. The next scorching day, Callie suggests cooling off at a spring, challenging Darkly's beliefs. She then shows ancient paintings in a cave, pointing to a red handprint, saying, part of its maker lives on. Drawn to Callie's mystique, Darkly confesses his feelings, but she stops him, caring for him as family. That night, distracted by Callie, Darkly fails to pack his belongings. The next day, Darkly picks flowers, but is downcast when Clay returns. Noticing a bird made of barbed wire, Darkly accidentally cuts himself, ignoring Callie's calls. That evening, Callie asks Clay if Darkly can stay permanently, explaining her silent partner communicates without words. Clay signals approval, and Callie shows her appreciation. When Darkly remarks on their lack of wedding rings, Callie clarifies they aren't married. Later that night, torn between beliefs and jealousy, Darkly adds Callie's apple core to his collection before going to bed. The next day, Darkly apprentices under the carpenter Clay, but annoys him with personal questions about Callie. That night, Darkly prays for guidance. On the seventh day, Clay tries bonding through tricks, but guests arrive as Darkly expresses frustration. Jude and the undertaker, Quincy, order coffins. Callie warmly welcomes them and introduces the recovered Darkly to Jude. Quincy introduces himself before escaping the heat on the porch. Distracted by watching Callie, Darkly ignores Jude's conversation attempts. Concerned, Jude invites Darkly for a cliffside talk. Jude tells Darkly that he understands Darkly's feelings for Callie, knowing her allure over men. However, he cautions that Callie and Clay have been inseparable since meeting. Having brought Darkly to Callie's home, Jude feels accountable for his conduct. Thus, he advises Darkly to respect Callie and Clay's relationship. When Darkly adamantly denies any affection for Callie, Jude politely apologizes. Still, he urges the man he rescued to heed his words, even if mistaken. To change topics, Jude shows Darkly a fossilized dinosaur dropping, making Darkly laugh for the first time. They quickly become friends. As Quincy's visit ends, Jude promises to return that night, seeking escape from his perplexing feelings for Callie. Darkly takes a stroll. The next morning, Darkly awakes in the woods to a peculiar sight, a giant silver shoe floating down the river. He watches it until out of view. On his way back, he meets Hunter Roxy and her dog. Guessing he slept in the woods, she shares her belief that people disappoint and abandon you, but the generous, timeless forest remains. As they walk, Darkly agrees the forest is beautiful, but Roxy disagrees. She warns a vicious monster lurks, feeding on handsome young men like him. At Roxy's motorhome, Darkly notices a barbed wire bird, prompting Roxy to explain she trained her dog with them to prevent mangling kills. Though painful, she felt the lesson necessary. Inviting him inside for coffee, Roxy asks if he's returning to Callie. Taken aback at her calling Callie a witch, Darkly asks why. Dryly, Roxy states the alluring woman is a witch, and his sleeping in the woods means he already knows why. Later, reflecting on his talk with Callie about Roxy, Callie called Roxy crazy and warned Darkly to avoid her. However, Callie admitted Roxy had reasons for hating her that she didn't want to discuss that night. Recalling Roxy's idea of learning through pain, Darkly finds penance by squeezing a barbed wire bird, injuring himself. On Darkly's 9th day there, Callie bandages his hands and warns to take care, as wounds can quickly turn poisonous. He abruptly leaves for the forest. Though concerned, Callie assures her lover that Darkly will return soon. Instead, Darkly goes to Roxy's. There, she shows a family photo, saying they once lived in Callie's house, her, husband Jake, and son Clay. But it ended when Jake found injured Callie in the woods, with Roxy accusing Callie of tempting Jake until he lost control, stopping his heart. Darkly states only a witch could do that, and Roxy agrees. She adds that ending Jake wasn't enough. The witch then spellbound her innocent son, Clay. Roxy insists Clay can never be happy since Callie is barren. They agree Callie's infertility is a curse from God. Finding comfort in Darkly, Roxy admits shooting at the house to remind Callie that divine punishment awaits. Later, while cleaning up, Darkly recalls Callie's story. Jake was ruthless and died forcing himself on her. Roxy used this to accuse Callie of stopping Jake's heart and enchanting Clay to banish Roxy, though Callie maintained innocence. As Clay gets the radio playing, he invites Callie to dance. Uncomfortable, Darkly retreats to the barn and wraps himself in barbed wire. The next day, though concerned for Darkly, he dismisses his pain as grief for his lost parents. That night, the dejected Darkly refuses dinner, worrying Callie. When she follows him outside, asking to help, he says he just needs time alone. Scared by his dark gaze, Callie mentions protective Clay. Demanding clarification, Clay emerges. Callie assures all is fine and bids Darkly goodnight before going inside. Darkly storms off into the woods in a foul mood. The next day, waking covered in ants, he goes to Roxy's. In the forest, Roxy mourns the death of her dog, feeling she has nothing left to live for. The apprentice helps her hold a funeral for her beloved pet, using a giant silver shoe they come across as a pyre. As the man stares into the flames, he unravels and soon hallucinates while wandering the woods. He recoils in fear as imagined parents order him to carry out the Lord's work. Deranged, the apprentice rushes home yelling for Kelly. The couple run out, and when he approaches her aggressively, Clay pushes him away and steps between them. A scuffle ensues, during which the apprentice's clothes tear, revealing the barbed wire binding his body. Horrified, Callie banishes him. After retrieving his container, the apprentice declares it's time for his own walk in the dark and heads to the cenote. Later, Jude learns his friend has disappeared. Insisting he wouldn't just vanish with nowhere to go, Jude searches the forest and finds the apprentice at the cenote, cradling his container. Reminding him of their plan to leave, Jude urges the apprentice to go that night. The apprentice refuses but suggests Jude return for him tomorrow night. Meanwhile, in her loneliness, Roxy takes her own life. The next day, the apprentice finds her body and hallucinates a conversation with his decaying parents, who insist he was put in the forest to serve a purpose. They dismiss Callie's words as lies and order the apprentice to purify the forest by spilling the witch's blood. That night, the apprentice covers himself in red paint and charcoal, taking on a demonic appearance. Wielding a chisel, he marches toward Callie's home as Jude arrives at the empty cenote. Sensing danger, Jude rushes to the house just as the crazed man breaks in, wrecking the home and declaring himself the witch's punishment. A vicious fight ensues until Jude shoots and kills the former apprentice, who wonders who will love him now that he's become a monster. Jude and Callie barely escape the burning home with Clay. The next morning, a circus family emerges from the forest. Noticing Callie's state, they offer help getting out of the woods. As the group exits, the man's son gives Callie a small silver shoe, a token from their sunken circus boat. Unaware, Callie heads out, while the apprentice's wounds fester, poisoning him figuratively.